Hey, what's going on? It's Brian Dawson. Thanks for tuning in to another segment of Triangle Empowered, where knowledge is power. This week and for the entire month of January, we'll be focusing on human trafficking. January, as you should know by now, is National Human Trafficking Awareness Month. For those of you who do not know, North Carolina has consistently ranked in the top 10 states for human trafficking, and human trafficking disproportionately affects women of color. With me today is my good friend, no stranger to the show, Kiricka Yarbough Smith. Kiricka is the Human Trafficking Program Director with the North Carolina Council for Women and Youth Involvement and the North Carolina Department of Administration. Hey, Kiricka.
Hey, Brian. Once again, how you doing?
Thanks for joining me today. The subject matter, of course, is human trafficking. This segment, we will focus on impacting communities.
Yeah.
Are you ready?
I am ready, Brian.
First question, are there specific populations that are more vulnerable to trafficking than others?
So absolutely. I think the thing to know that is with human trafficking, anybody is vulnerable, first of all. But I think the thing about when we're looking at vulnerable populations, usually it's the people who are vulnerable to a lot of other things, like people who are homeless, youth and adults, but particularly youth who identify as LGBTQ, youth who are in the child welfare system or foster care, ones who have little to no supervision, people with mental illness or any sort of developmental disabilities. We also see a lot of times people who have substance abuse issues, youth and adults who are living in poverty. If they have a history of abuse, usually traffickers can identify that and that they will exploit that. Also people who are undocumented or if they're immigrants or refugees. And then finally, I would say another category are people who are limited English proficient, but also when we think about our youth, like African-American youth as well.
Next question is very important. Why are people of color considered more vulnerable in this time?
I mean, I think one of the things when we're thinking about people of color in particular, Brian, is a lot of times we have people living below the poverty line, for instance. And like I just mentioned, traffickers are actually looking and targeting people who are in low income situations. We also look at a lot of families who parents are working, they're working after school hours. A lot of traffickers are targeting our youth, for instance, between those hours of 3 and 6 when the parents are at work. So the parents are working and they're not home with them. So a lot of times they are targeting them. Also, a lot of our essential workers right now, the people who are actually still going to work every day, are people of color. And so, children are sometimes home with the school closures without supervision or without a parent in the home. So traffickers are looking, unfortunately.
Wow. Very dangerous. How can socioeconomic status contribute to trafficking vulnerabilities, during COVID-19?
I think, one of the things that we talked about a little bit with, all of the parents, a lot of the parents being essential workers, of course, definitely is something that we see a lot, Brian. But I think one thing that we often forget is that whenever you have high stress situations, whenever people are struggling financially, stress increases. So that also means that abuse is going to increase, unfortunately. And so we see more cases of child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault. And so you're also going to see more cases of human trafficking. Also, we see more homelessness because, with the rent halts and bill freezes and different things right now. Luckily, we do have legislation in place for right now, a moratorium on people being put out or evicted out of their homes. But there are some private landlords that people are still being evicted. And so families are having to figure out, how do we pay bills? And unfortunately, some of them have found that way to be exploiting children and the people who live within that home. And then also just thinking about anytime you don't have money, it's going to create, another layer of sort of vulnerability. Right. And you're going to feel like you have to do things to get what you need. And so sometimes it ends up being trafficking is what happens.
Now you spoke of abuse. Yeah. Here's the $5 million question. Why don't victims often report this type of abuse?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things with that is that, especially with human trafficking, they don't know that they're victims of abuse. A lot of times when we think about human trafficking, when you think sexual assault, people say, well, did you say no? Or if you think about domestic violence, people will ask that question, about, like, were you in a relationship with this person, all of those things, and you think about that. But with trafficking, it's like, well, I didn't really say no. It was sort of my boyfriend or significant other, a person that I'm dating. And so they feel like they did it, they did something wrong. And so a lot of times they don't feel like it's actually a crime. Also, traffickers have the ability, similar to domestic violence perpetrators, of where they isolate their victims.
Wow.
So they're confined. A lot of times, so many trafficking survivors that we know have been held captive, and they're isolated from friends and family. Or if they talk to friends and family, they're on speakerphone so that the trafficker can hear every conversation that they're having. They are constantly using threat, physical harm. Also, they're dependent on the trafficker because now I need that person to eat. Also, if they're using, and I mentioned before that sometimes people who are addicted to substances will be a very easy target for a trafficker, because then if you're addicted to a substance and you're dependent on me for that substance, then, you're going to do what I say because you need it. And so that's another way that we see it. Also, traffickers have a way of really trying to convince their victims that they love them and that they're going to be there for them, even though they're in the midst of exploiting them. We see a lot of people who are brought into sort of trafficking situations where they have kind of been, they're missing that love, they're missing the support and, low self-esteem. And so the trafficker makes them feel like they're going to take care of them and they're going to be there. And so they have this trauma bond to the trafficker. And so they won't report. They're feeling like they have to be there for them. They have to support them. Things are going to get better if they just make a little bit more money, if they just do what the traffickers asked them to do. And I think finally, one of the things that we really forget about is that trafficking victims, they don't know that they can trust us, whether you're a social service provider or law enforcement. They might not know that they may know that the trafficker is doing things to them that they shouldn't be doing, but at least they know what's going to happen when they go home. They don't know when we say, well, we're going to help you, we're going to support you. Most likely, they've been let down quite a bit by a lot of us in their life.
Right. And building that trust and that bond got to be important.
Absolutely.
You spoke about like family members, best friends, cousins, sisters, brothers. Somebody knows. So speaking of reporting human trafficking, how can our listeners report suspected human trafficking, or how can they learn more information?
Absolutely. So first, to learn more information about trafficking, I would say you could definitely go to the National Human Trafficking Hotline's website, but you also can go to the Council for Women's website, and that is ncouncilforwomen.gov. And we have resources in local communities. So the wonderful thing about that is we have our domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, child advocacy centers. All the people who support victims in local communities in all 100 counties are listed on that in that resource guide that we have, so you can connect to them there. But if you want to report suspected cases of human trafficking, you don't need to investigate and figure out if it is trafficking. If you feel like you know what trafficking is and you feel like it could be happening, we want you to automatically call that National Human Trafficking Hotline number.